Seated. All right, so the question I want to put before us is this. And let me say, first of all, that this particular strategic planning session is an invitation for us to step back several paces and to think very broadly, to think kind of long-term about some current practical problems that we're facing. And so this, unlike the funding for full-time ministers or even the plan for church, how to plant churches and so on, this doesn't have an immediate payoff. This is not something that we put in our pocket and take tomorrow and run with. It's more of an invitation to a paradigm shift in our own minds and in our forward thinking. How are we going to chart a course going forward? What do we envision if the Lord is pleased to bless us? Without his blessing, of course, everything else would be in vain. And so the practical question is this: how are we going to long-term sustain resources for the development and extension of the presbytery? How are we going to have ongoing funding for full-time ministers in early church planting situations? How are we going to continue this, huge workload that we've adopted as a presbytery, many different fronts, many different projects, many different ideas, without the manpower? So how are we going to harness the manpower to carry forward those projects and those ideals and the things that we're seeking to do, right? Something has to be put in place in terms of our minds and our ideas of how this will be sustained. We have need for money, we have need for manpower, and in what ways will these needs best be met under the blessing of God? So I have, what I did is I sat down and just spent some time thinking, right? I'm just thinking about the problem and what would be some of the solutions. And in the process of thinking and reflecting, both biblically and historically, I developed some ideas I'm going to pitch to you. You're welcome to blow holes through this. You can shoot it down, blow it up, whatever else. It's merely here to help generate some thoughts for us. So we have a few models at present, alive and well in the American context. The first is what I'm going to call the mega church model. We're all familiar with this. Someone rightly identified my poor artwork and recognized that this is supposed to be a circus tent, and that's exactly what it's supposed to be. So the mega church model is as shallow as a cookie sheet, as my grandfather from Mississippi would say. It's very thin, no depth, very wide, and it's this kind of expansive, burgeoning, self-focused model. And what ends up happening is you'll have 6 ministers on staff, you'll have 6 ministers, you'll have plus, untold numbers of staff, and there's huge resources, but all of the resources are poured back into the big tent, right? So the mega church model is self-inflating, and it's always expanding and pouring back into itself predominantly, right? So we're familiar with this. I don't need to go on at length about it. In reaction to the mega church model, in my mind, we've had in the 20th century, at least within the American context, kind of a pendulum swing. So we look at the mega church model and we say, this is terrible, this is unbiblical. I mean, this is a big warehouse, the people come and go and they're anonymous and there's no shepherding and there's no substantial work that's going on, bad theology and so on. And it's resulted for many within American Presbyterians, it's resulted in the development of what I'm going to call the mini church model. Right, the mini church model, and so say this is bad. We want to go the other way, and therefore we're going to have very small churches because then there's accountability and there's all sorts of other things that come with that. Now, so for many the idea is, well, we have a church in a local place, and it gets to be 100 people. Well, then we take 25 of those people and we plant another church. and then when that gets to be 100 people, you plant another church. And so there's the multiplication of many churches within the same geographical region. So I'm not talking about the kind of church planting where we're going to plant a church in Oregon and Wyoming and Arizona and Pennsylvania. I'm talking about, I'm talking about multiple church planting instances of little churches in one geographical region. Well, what ends up happening with this is now we have 6 ministers, right? And we have, in this case, 6 buildings that have to be rented or owned. And we have 6 sets of operating expenses and so on. Right? And so what ends up happening is these churches end up living hand to mouth. And you end up with a point of similarity, in my estimation, to the megachurch model, and that is they end up being entirely self-focused. So all of the money that's being generated is being poured back into the local situation. And that's necessary, of course, to sustain the 6 ministers, the 6 buildings, the operational expenses, and so on and so forth. But it ends up becoming very, sometimes small, sometimes fledgling, sometimes not, but pretty self-focused, almost by necessity. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, so this is where we're at. It makes it very difficult in terms of meeting the needs that we have. So I go back to Scripture and I see these models. So one example that we have is here in 2 Corinthians 9, where you have these churches in Macedonia and Achaia and Corinth and so on, and they're very outward focused, right? They're not takers, they're givers. And what we would prize as a virtue in an individual, biblically was seen as a virtue corporately as churches as well. The emphasis on giving to other places, right? That's how the New Testament church worked. The church in Jerusalem, Judea, obviously was in great need, and that need was supplied, as well as the interconnectional apostolic Presbyterianism, right? So it's a practical expression of biblical apostolic Presbyterianism. Then I thought more, and I thought, this mini church model, as I reflect historically, is surprisingly not really to be found or hardly found. It certainly wasn't the case in the patristic era. It wasn't in the case in the Reformation era. It's not how they operated in the Reformation era. It's not how they operated in the Second Reformation, whether you're talking the Netherlands or Germany or France, much less England and Scotland. That's not the model that was being followed. And historically, it wasn't the case. At the time of the disruption, there would be lots of churches, for example, in Glasgow. I mean, there might be 30 churches, but it wasn't the mini church model. And, you're talking churches, maybe there's 30 churches, but one is 2,000 and one is 1,000 people, and, some of them are 300 and so on and so forth, right? They're not having a church of 50 people every 50 feet, throughout Glasgow or whatever. And even to the present day, you look, for example, at the Dutch churches, which have done more, and they have their own advantages and peculiarities, but they've done more in terms of giving, in terms of putting money out the door, in terms of mission support, both domestic and foreign. They've done more. They're certainly not following the mini church model either, right? You think of the Heritage Reformed or the Free Reformed even. So I thought, well, this is just interesting. So what's the deal? So this got me thinking further, and now that brings us to what I'm here to kind of pitch to you, and that is what I'm calling the mature church model. And with the mature church model, rather than taking, let's say, 300 people and dividing it into 6 churches of 50 people each, let's just say 300 people, for example, what you have is one minister, and you have one building, and you have one set of operating expenses, right? Operating expenses. So you have one set of all of that. And now, the point I want to make is, you are therefore able to increase significantly what we might call discretional funds, right? The funds that are above and beyond the basic commitments that a congregation needs in order to function. And I think there's something here, I could be wrong, and you're welcome to disagree vehemently with me, but what I'm thinking is this. If we going forward, this is not something that's right at our doorstep right now, something we can take away, but if we're looking long term to have the idea of a mature church where we're actually reducing, right, this is a subtraction symbol, we're reducing as we're living as tight as we can, right? So the priority of every congregation would be to live thin, right? To minimize local expenses. So it's not the big circus tent where all the money's getting dumped back in, but congregations saying, okay, we got a minister, we got a building, we're renting a building, whatever we're doing, we have our operational expenses, we're keeping things tight. It's a priority for us to live thin. Then we're maximizing the amount of money and manpower that we have above and beyond that. And what that does is then enables every local congregation to increase, that's an addition sign, the discretional funds and multiply how much is going out the door. So in a mature church model, you would have money going out the door, lots of money, hopefully, with the Lord's blessing going out the door. You'd have manpower going out the door as well, and you'd have what I'm going to call material. And so let me just explain this briefly. So money, obviously we're not paying 6 ministers, 6 buildings, 6 operational expenses. We're not dumping money back into ourselves, but rather that money is going toward enabling church planting pastors to go full time from the beginning, as well as our other ministers. And it's enabling us to send a whole lot more to Spain and Sri Lanka and this, that, and the other place on the foreign mission field. And so the priority of I think a mature church, as we see in the New Testament, is that the number one priority is in some ways how much can we put outside the door. Deacons' courts and sessions would be thinking in terms of what percentage of our income is actually not going back into us, but is going out to the advance of the kingdom elsewhere. And we would measure our success isn't the right word, our stewardship. We would measure our stewardship on the increasing percentage that is going out the door, both domestically and on the foreign field. Same thing is true with manpower. So we need, obviously in the older model, you only have one minister. I mean, your expenses are limited to one minister, but then you have a body of solid elders. In Stornoway, our congregation probably has 12 elders, but in the old days, there might have been 30 elders, and there would have been elder districts, and there would have been deacons' court districts, as you see with Chalmers and so on, and a robust care. It's not people living in anonymity, but real care that's being taken seriously for the people on the ground. But in terms of manpower, when I say out the door, I mean, elders, for example, or deacons involved at the presbyterial level. Obviously not just assessor elders, but people using their gifts, devoting their time and energy, not to just the local work, but to the work of presbytery as a whole. This would include, of course, sending missionaries out of our congregations to the foreign field as well, and other things. By material, I mean local congregations are working on things, and maybe they have, for example, they've developed a plan with diaconal care on how to process needs or something. They've put a lot of research and time into it. They take that and it ends up becoming standardized. They're able to stick that out the door, and other congregations are able to pick up on their work and run with it and implement it in their own local congregations and so on. We could multiply examples, but you see that this is another way of emphasizing the idea of having maximizing how much goes out the door. That requires, of course, living thin. It requires keeping our basic expenses as tight as we can, not going into the refusing the big tent where we become local centric, where we're thinking merely about ourselves, but rather we are givers corporately as congregations. We are givers, and we are interested in the broader church and in the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ. I think this reflects maturity. Obviously, we're not at the point as a presbytery to just kind of implement this tomorrow, as it were, but it does set, I mean, if this is even remotely close to right, it does set expectations for us. It does give us a little paradigm shift, and it gives us a sense of direction. What are we praying for? What are we hoping for? I mean, in some ways, sessions like this that are nuts and bolts feel unspiritual, but we of course don't take it that way. Obviously, we're not thinking in terms of those that way. We're thinking in terms of dependence upon the Lord, service to Christ, the extension of the glory of Christ. How can we help our brethren? How can we demonstrate real support in practical ways within our presbytery and the church more broadly? How can we take the kinds of things that are exemplified in the New Testament and put them to work in the present 21st century American context? So, I've given you an abbreviated form. I actually pitched this to some of our own officers prior to this, and you're getting a far more abbreviated form. This isn't supposed to be an address, after all. I'm already probably in trouble. But it's a means of priming the pump and thinking through trajectory, where we're going as a presbytery, and how we can accomplish some of the things that we have fire in our belly about, and sustain things going forward. All right, so that's the priming of the pump.